What is up, YouTube? Hello, Party Parrots. Today, we have a very special video for you guys. This is a video that I'm calling Marvel Snap Wrapped. This is going to be a brand new video format that I'm hoping to do moving forward, where we take the month, in this case December 2023, and look at all of the cards that released and give you guys kind of a review here for after we've had some time to play with these cards. I know a lot of people do kind of reviews where they look at the cards before they come out or in that kind of first week, let kind of build up some hype, let you know if you should spend your spotlight caches. But I think that this will be a great video for you looking forward as cards come back into spotlight caches, or if you're just curious, was Havok as bad as people thought he was going to be? Where did Blob end up? We can give these cards kind of after we've had some time to play with them, really take a look at them and give you guys a final kind of score here. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time here at the end where I give you guys just a quick rundown of like a little bit of the meta cards that kind of poked their heads out here as like where they did away from previous months and any big news that happened. We can kind of cover that here. So without further ado, here is December 2023 wrapped. Our first card of this month was new season pass release, Sebastian Shaw. Now, there's going to be kind of three metrics that I'm going to use to kind of review these cards. And I'm going to give everything a review out of 4 spotlight caches. So, the first thing I'm going to be looking at is their overall power level. What was this card's just was it a meta breaking card? Was it everywhere? Was it solid? Was it just doesn't really have the power there? We're going to be looking at that. Then we're going to be looking at deck kind of variety. This is how many decks can this card fit into? How many are different archetypes? Is it bringing new archetypes into the format? Is it just kind of slotting into already existing decks? Where is it kind of in this deck variety? And finally, the third metric I'm going to be using is kind of the future, looking forward in 2 months, in 6 months, in a year. Do I think this is a card that has real staying power? Do I think that this card's going to easily just looking for one more kind of enabler piece? Or is this a card that I think is maybe at risk of, well, it's doing its thing now, but I can find a hard time a new deck that it's going to go into. So we're going to be reviewing this card for all of those. So first up, Sebastian Shaw, 3/4. When this card permanently gains power, gain +2 more power. Now, for power level, I think this card is a very, very solid 2.5 out of 4, I would say. 2.5, almost 3. I think this card, he's powerful. And if you put him with a card like Surfer or Forge, he's a 3/8, which is great. And you put them together, he can get really big. There just aren't a crazy number of amazing enablers for him right now. And so I think 2.5 is a pretty good amount to be to give him here. And I think that he's really great in the surfer decks, but he really doesn't have a home outside of them, which brings us up into our next category of deck variety. Now, I'm gonna give him again I'm gonna give him a 2 out of 4 here. And the reason for this is that I think he only really has one deck right now, and that is these Silver Surfer lists. But the good thing about Silver Surfer, it is a very customizable list where you can decide if Mobius is really good in the format, well, Surfer's a perfect slot for that. If you want to be playing Nakias and Okoyes to make him bigger, you can absolutely. Or if you just want to be playing cards like Wave, Polaris, just big card Spider-Man. He's also just great in those decks. And however you want to customize him, he's great with Killmonger and Nova. He just really allows for a ton of deck building, even if it really is only one archetype. So I'm going to give him a 2 out of 4 there. I think he's better than he seems, even though he's only slotting into one deck. That one deck has a lot of different ways to build it, and I think that's kind of great. Finally, for the third thing, looking into the future, I'm going to give him a 3.5 out of 4 here. I think he has a ton of potential. This is a card that, looking at kind of the data mines and what cards are slated to release here over the next month or two, there's nothing that immediately is looking at making him better. But the fact that just any card that gives power he gains power from that. Means that with us getting 5 or 6 cards a month here as we go forward, I would be shocked if there wasn't at least 2 new cards that are going to be enablers for him. How good they will be, I don't know. What they'll do, I'm not sure. But with 50, 60 cards coming out this year, potentially more, I would be shocked if one of them, I mean, look at a card like Captain America, ongoing, give all your cards +1. If that became an on reveal or a new card released that with an on reveal, what's the first card people are going to be thinking of? Sebastian Shaw. If we get a big forge at any point, that instead of being a cheap card that can give a +2, you have a big card that gives a huge bonus, almost like a Shuri. Well, Sebastian Shaw. I think this is a card that, looking forward, I'm going to be pretty much checking every single card where I'm going to say, wait, is this good in Shaw? Maybe this can branch out Shaw into a whole new deck out of Surfer. So I think he has a ton of potential coming up. And I would not be shocked if there was a whole new Sebastian Shaw deck by this time 2024. So keep an eye out for that. For my final review, I'm going to give Sebastian Shaw a 3 out of 4. I think his power level, the amount of decks he can go into, and the looking into the future, I think 3 out of 4 Spotlight Cash is a great kind of review to give him in, and overall I'm very happy with this release. Next up, we have Series 5 card Blob, who has the power of 4 and the cost of 6. With the on reveal, merge your deck into this, gaining all of your deck's total power with the ongoing of can't be moved. Now, for power level, first thing to review this card, I think this card's a 4 out of 4. This is a card that I think in many ways was the boogeyman of the format. Him and his Thanos lists were just dominating for a while. And I think his a lot of that is just his power, which is basically he is the most amount of power you can put into one lane with a 6 drop. He's very regularly in the 30s, in the 40s. I've seen him very, very regularly. He's even decks where you're not straight building for those 30 or 40 in the Thanos list, he's still usually going to be the biggest 6 drop you can play, going up into the mid 20s, into the mid 30s. So I think his power level, what he's done to the meta, I think he's a very solid 4 out of 4. Blob brought the power this month. Looking into deck variety, I'm going to give him a 3.5 out of 4. I do think while he really found that Thanos slot, that's not the only deck for him, and we've actually have seen a lot of very fun things with him. People play ramping into him on 5 and then taskmastering on 6. People playing him in Reanimator, Hella lifts with Modoc and such. People trying him out in Living Tribunal. I think really just any deck that's like, hey, I want a giant 6 drop bigger than anything else. What do you got for me? Well, build your deck a little bit, throw in a couple cards that can help enable him, some other big cards, and Blob is that card. Again, I really think that that Blob Thanos deck is where he's really found his home, but I do think there are a lot more decks with Blob, maybe even some that we haven't found yet, where he's just solid. Finally, looking at in the future, this one I'm going to give him a little bit lower. I'm only going to give him a 3 out of 4 Spotlight Caches here. And this is because I just, he's not a card that's like looking for his enabler like Sebastian Shaw was, or like looking into the future like, oh, like there's very obviously this just missing this archetype needs a couple more cards. A card like Silver Surfer, obviously any 3 drop is going to be, well, what about Surfer or Zabu is going to be looking at every 4 drop? Blob doesn't really have that. That being said, what he's doing of just putting so much power onto that 6 turn, I mean, that's just, there's going to be decks coming up that are going to want that. What they are, what they're going to look like, I'm not sure, but it would not surprise me at all if as new decks are coming up, Blob fits into them perfectly or doesn't. Again, he's not like he's a sure fit in X deck, but I do think that he's going to remain a very viable option as we move into 2024. So, overall, I'm going to give him a final rating of 4 out of 4 caches. I think this is a great card. I think he has potential in the future. I think right now you're going to have a ton of things to do with him, and he's also just has a very solid meta deck right now. I think this is a card you should be looking at getting if he interests you. I don't think he's you know, this one card is going to go into every single deck going forward, but he's pretty much checking every single box of if you want this card, get it. So, final review 4 out of 4 spotlight caches. Next up, we have Series 4 card Havok. Havok is a 2/0 with the ability of at the end of each turn, you lose 1 max energy and gain +4 power. What this means is that whatever turn you play him on, you basically cap yourself at that amount of energy. If you only play him on turn 2, you're going to have 2 energy every turn for the rest of the game. Whereas if you play him on turn 5, you will have 5 energy on turn 6, or if there's a potential turn 7. And if you play him on turn 6, then he won't actually affect your energy at all, as that'll happen at the end of turn 6. So he's basically just a 2/4 in that case. So getting into the review, this with total power level, I'm going to give this card a solid 3 out of 4 spotlight caches. I think he actually has a lot of power here, and while he's not a meta breaking card, he is potentially the biggest 2-drop you can be playing. Now, he's very answerable with cards like Shang-Chi or Shadow King, but I think people kind of found out that playing him on turn 5 is a really great time to play him, as he's a 2/8 in that case, and he only takes 1 energy away from your 6th turn. And that drawback is very real. This is not a card that you just slot into any deck, as you really want to kind of maximize him, and the best way to maximize his ability is by only playing him on that 5th or 6th turn, sometimes 4th, and really building your deck around not needing 6 energy on turn 6. And I do think that as we played through this card throughout the month, a lot of people realize that that's not the hardest uh, question to ask. It is not impossible to build a deck where you only use 5 energy on turn 5, on turn 6. We looked at decks like Bounce. We looked at mixing cards with Ravona or Annihilus shells that really used Havok, because that 1 extra energy, just turning that into 4 power on turn 6 was very good. So overall, I'm going to give him a 3 out of 4 for power level. I don't think he's a meta breaking card, but I do think that he is powerful with a very real downside. Moving on to the next category, we have deck variety. Now, this one I'm going to be pretty generous with. I'm going to give him 3.5 out of 4 spotlight caches. I think that this card really just needs you to basically ask yourself, I don't need all 6 mana on turn 6. He's a very real card. Mixing him with cards like Havok so that or Ravona so that he only costs 1 is very real. Any low to the ground kind of bounce list. If you're playing a card like Bishop where you want to be just playing a bunch of cards out as many times as possible. All these low cost kind of cards, bounce, some Annihilus shells. I think that Havok is just a really good card, and he's really bringing so much power that there are times when I'm building a deck and I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, can I fit Havok in here? And actually, like, going back and being like, oh, if I just, instead of playing a card like Hitmonkey, maybe I play Havok, and that way I can be just getting that consistent power there. Or instead of playing a big 6-drop like Magneto or Doctor Doom in this deck, is it actually just better to be playing Havok and have this scaling threat? And like, that's a really good place for a card to be, and for a game to be, is asking yourself these questions when you're in deck building. Can I tweak my deck a little bit to put this powerful card in? Is exactly what this card is off asking. Finally, we have the third, and that is future. This one I'm going to be a bit harsher on. I think looking into the future, I'm going to give him a 2.5. I think the positives of the future are any deck that's more low to the ground, like we've seen Bounce really take off this year with cards like Hitmonkey and Nico, even Werewolf for a time. I think Havok was a great uh, card for those. And if we get more decks like that that just don't really care about using all 6 energy on turn 6, or potentially even a deck that didn't even want 5 energy on turn 5, that you could play this card pretty consistently on turn 4, that sounds great. That being said, he's really only power. That's the only thing this card's doing, and he's not a strong enabler, and he's not really looking for any really strong enablers. He's not like Shaw, where it's like, oh, any card that gives power is making me relook at Shaw. He's just saying, I am going to bring a ton of power for any card that has any deck that has a bunch of little things. Is that something you're doing? So, could he get outclassed? Yes. Could bounce decks and certain decks start moving more into the hit monkey and away from the havoc? Also, yes. Is what he's asking impossible? No. And I do think that there could be more decks coming up, more cards coming up that do make Havoc stronger. So I'm going to give him a 2.5 out of 4 there. And that will finally lead us into the final review. I'm actually going to give him a 3 out of 4 spotlight caches. And I think this is really surprising for a lot of people. A lot of people read his ability and was like, this card is terrible. The best thing you can do is Viper it over to your opponent. And then they changed Viper. So why would I even want this? But I think it has a couple things going for it. And that is, one, just the sheer amount of stats it puts out. Two, how, yes, it is asking a lot, but if you build your deck with that in mind, well, you can really use that, again, sheer amount of stats. And three, the fact that it's in Series 4, I think also makes it that it is a pretty good pickup. I wouldn't, be rushing, oh, I need this card. Oh, next time it comes up in the Spotlight Cache, you have to get Havoc. Definitely a card to keep your eye out. And the fact that it's only 3,000 credits, if you want it, it's half as much as a lot of these Series 5 cards, and I think it's a really great pickup. So finally, we have our last Series 5 card, Selene. Selene is a 1 -1 with the on reveal, afflict the lowest power card in each player's hand with -3 power. Now, go right into it. Power level, I think this card was a bit of a miss. I'm going to give her 1.5 out of 4. I think the fact that your opponent can simply not play the card, and the fact that it is symmetrical, meaning that you want some card that works well with her. And while there are obviously the goblins and a card like Hood that you can either Annihilus or Viper over is great and feels really good. The fact that there's really only 3 cards, with Black Widow getting her change from a 2-1 to a 3-3, I think she would have been a perfect card for this. Uh, Being able to Annihilus or Viper Black Widow over after she had her on reveal, and the fact that she never got to really do that, I think was a pretty big mark against her. So I just don't really think that she's pretty easy to play around. She's not very noticeable when she's doing her thing, but she's not unplayable. I don't think that she's a card that you regret really having in your deck by any means. And again, she works super well with goblins. She's really fun in an Annihilus shell to kind of fill up their board with more of these minus power cards, her with Hood and uh, goblins and such. It is a good feeling and it is fun. I just don't think that the power's there. And really, I don't think she's doing enough for these kind of junk shells, some of these bounce shells where it's like, oh, you need to be putting Selene in your deck. She feels like the 10th or 11th card in a lot of these decks. And that's just, for those being her decks, that feels kind of bad. So I'm gonna give her a 1.5 out of 4 for power level. Uh, but moving on into deck variety, this is somewhere that I actually think she kind of shines. I'm gonna give her a 3 out of 4 spotlight caches for deck variety. I think uh she immediately went into a lot of cards with Annihilus shells. She was great in those decks. She still is. I've been playing her with a lot of success in werewolf decks. Werewolf with the goblins, which is a deck that I always wanted to try, and I think Selene was definitely a missing piece that made that deck feel a lot better. She's good with Galactus, playing her, and then annihilating her over and getting a -11 power Hobgoblin is great in a Galactus shell. And then surprisingly, at least to me, she actually feels pretty good in bounce. Playing her over and over again can be pretty fun, and then especially building up a really negative powered like hood or something, and then vipering it over can be really fun. So I think she can kind of slot into a lot of different decks, and it's definitely fun. And any deck that you're looking at, think cards like the Goblins or Hood, you're definitely going to be looking at Selene. So I think she has a lot of fun variety to her. I'm going to give her a 3 out of 4 again for variety. And then looking into the future, I'm going to give her a 2 out of 4. While I do think that it's kind of obvious, if you will, when any new card is going to be good with her. And looking at the next couple of months, I don't immediately see any enablers or cards that she enables. But I think the hardest part in looking into the future is asking yourself, how many more goblin effects are we going to get? You know, how many more cards like the Hood? This is the first negative power card we've had since release, since they've even added before then in beta when they started adding new cards. She has been the first one. So while I don't think it is a design space that they're never going to do, I don't think she's the last negative power card or the last kind of card for these junk shells. I do think that it's probably a much narrower design space than it initially seems. And so while I do think cards for Selene are coming, how strong are they going to be? You know, is it going to be 3 years down the line? Is it going to be 3 months down the line? I'm not sure. They definitely exist, and I do think that they will be coming at some point, which is why I'm giving her a 2 out of 4. But I just think it's a lot narrower, and kind of the history of Snap has shown that this isn't something that they want to do a ton of, which I think is probably good. Junk is a pretty uh, harsh matchup for a lot of people, and if it gets too strong, I think people will be very upset. So I think in looking to the future, I think a 2 out of 4 is kind of a great. I think she's very easy to enable with new card design, but will they do that? And I'm not quite sure. So overall, I'm going to give her that 2 out of 4 ranking. I think she was overall probably the biggest miss, if you will, of this month. And while I think she definitely has her place and she's a really fun card, she's also kind of feels like the 10th or 11th card, even in her own decks. So I think she's a pretty easy skip if you want looking to the future when she comes up back around in Spotlight caches, or if you're deciding on tokens. I don't think she's unplayable. I mean, she's still a 2 out of 4, but I do think she definitely missed the mark on a lot of metrics for a lot of people. Finally, to wrap up on our month of December here, for the news section, we had some really big news of the announcement of the return of series drops. Yes, we've been asking for this for a long time. I think everyone wants series drops, whether you're a whale or a brand new free to play player. Series drops are great for everyone. They announced not just the list of cards that are going to be dropping here on in January, but they also announced that they will be doing these not regularly. They don't want us to know when they're doing this, but they will be doing this more often going forward, and that this kind of gap between the last series drop and now was kind of the longest that they would want it to go reasonably. I think this was huge news for everyone. I'm super excited to pick up some of these cards. Cards like Echo dropping to Series 4, and Stature and Master Mold dropping down to Series 3. I mean, I think this is great news for everybody, and I'm very excited for the future of series drops going forward. So my mind, this was a thumbs up for me. And then moving over to the meta section of here, to kind of break it up a little bit, I think the four kind of cards or decks, if you will, that I would consider the new meta for the month of December were the Blob. Certainly, with the Blob's release, we brought back good old Shang Thanos kind of control here, and Blob really brought a new level of power to that that's still being seen. Where he'll end up in a couple of months from now remains to be seen. It looks like Thanos might be getting some goodies, so I expect this deck to stay powerful for a while. Uh, it also, December, really brought out, I'd say, the best of the Living Tribunal. Seems like a lot of people worked on a lot of different ways to play Living Tribunal, and I think this is definitely the month where I've seen the most, and he's had the most success with these Living Tribunal kind of decks. I've seen a lot of different ways that they've been played. They seem very good against things like Professor X. They seem very good at just putting a ton of power on the board when it all comes together. So I think Living Tribunal is definitely a big December meta card. We also had Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel is just seeing so much play in lockdown lists and mid-range lists, and Loki decks are trying her out. I'm just seeing this card everywhere. Living Tribunal, even. If you wanted to ask me what the winner for December was, I would say Miss Marvel. I think people are really starting to just realize that almost any deck should be putting her in. It wouldn't surprise me if we started seeing her in decks like Silver Surfer. Just 415 is very, very powerful. We also, even after his kind of nerf with the last patch, Shang-Chi only hitting cards that have 10 or more, he's just been steadily creeping up and up and up, and more decks seem to be putting him in as the tech card. And I think he's just now a big part of the December meta. He's a card that need to be expecting out of pretty much every single deck here. So definitely a card to keep an eye out. We'll see how the meta changes as we move into January. But not just the December meta, we also had the December winners. Now, these are a couple of cards that I think really had big touches and really came into this new December meta. I think number one was Black Knight with his change to his Ebony Blade being unable to be have its power reduced and indestructible. We've seen a lot of Black Knight decks, a lot of different variation of Black Knights, and I think he's a card that's going to be here with us to stay moving forward. Uh, with a lot of these lockdown and kind of control lists, we've also seen a lot of Goose, and this is a card that I think is makes total sense to have in the meta. I think it's a lot of if you're playing a deck like Bounce or Silver Surfer, Goose is a card that you really want to try to squeeze in if you can right now. He works on I think all of the cards I just showed in the in my metas slide, so hopefully you can just see how much power he has. Another big winner we had was Maximus, and I'm using Maximus kind of also as a catch-all for the new Gladiator. Uh, because yeah, both of those cards had their numbers changed here in the most recent OTA, and they're just proving to be very solid and a ton of power that you can put on the board with these cards that kind of negate their downside. They're showing up in more mid-range decks. They're showing up in as enablers for cards like Ronin. You're just going to see a ton of Maximus, and I think we're going to see a ton of Maximus moving forward. We also saw Leech kind of come back. A lot of decks like Darkhawk and She-Not that kind of stayed in the meta here found that the best way for them to beat cards like Blob and Doctor Doom was by working these leeches into their lists. So I think the little green guy definitely had a good month this month. And finally, I don't actually own her, unfortunately, but we saw Echo. Lots of people putting Echoes into a lot of decks with Living Tribunals, Miss Marvels kind of showing up, Professor X's kind of showing up in record numbers this month. I think a lot of people went back and said, oh, this Echo card, maybe this is the time to be playing her. And yeah, I definitely think she had a great month. Finally, to talk about some December losers, I think we had a very big uh, patch, and I think the card I'd say probably got hit the hardest was this Werewolf by Night. Going from a 3/3 to a 4/4 was a huge blow to him, and I think jury's kind of out on if he's even going to be playable and what degree he is going to be. I think he'll still have somewhat of a home, but he's way less exciting than he was. Viper also went from a 2/3 to a 3/4, and I think she's finding her slot in a lot of decks a lot harder to maintain. I think a lot of people were already cutting her for just a card like Annihilus and realizing that you didn't need just the Viper version, and Annihilus was fine. And this most recent change to her definitely made her standing a little bit harder. Just to go into some meta things, then we had Shuri, and I just think that with a lot of cards like Blob coming out, some of these Miss Marvel decks just putting like having a 415, people are realizing that Shuri just is isn't as strong as it once was. I think it's falling out of favor here. Also, Apocalypse. I think a lot of the more traditional, almost pool two discard lists of just discarding as many cards as you can and setting up for a big Dracula, uh, have playing out a bunch of swarms. Uh, when that America Chavez rework happened, I think this deck was the deck that got hit the most from it, as this was actually trying to play Chavez kind of the fair way. And also, as a lot of these, again, Blob and just a ton of power, Miss Marvel putting 15 power on the play, see more and more play Living Tribunal. These Apocalypse lists, even when they are kind of ignoring their Chavez rework and everything's coming together, they're just kind of getting outclassed, sadly. And I really hope we can see more success with this list and these discard lists moving forward. But that's going to do it for the video. Thanks everyone who stopped by. Thanks for watching, and we're gonna have a really exciting week. I'm so excited for 2024 and what Marvel Snap's bringing. We have potentially 2 new cards releasing this week, so if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, follow me on Twitch, and enjoy the rest of your day.